Okay, thank you for the last presentation from the Digital Transformation track today. Thank you all for being here. It's my first time presenting this slide deck, so I'm very curious to see what your reactions are and how it results with you. So what I'm going to tell you and discuss with you is the way that we're looking at it from the digital transformation perspective and how you can manage your bimodal Mode 2 portfolio. Now that's a mouthful. So I'm not sure whether, who of you have been able to attend the earlier digital transformation tracks? So there's a few of them out there. Who has familiarity with the start, structure, scale model from Mendix? Okay, so there's a lot more to it, but in essence it's about helping our organizations, our customers, start small, selecting the first app, having an app with the dimensions of a wow factor. It needs to be simple. You need to be able to create that app in around 30 days, and especially you need to be able to celebrate the fact that you were able to build that specific app. Then we're talking about the structure phase. And the structure phase is much more about building the structure to accelerate innovation. It is about having that first project as a stepstone to apply a more structured approach to bimodal IT. You will see that you'll start to work on multiple apps. You need to think about how can you accelerate innovation by taking on multiple projects to support those digital initiatives. And the portfolio of the Mode 2 apps, you also need to think about the right architecture and the right governance around the different apps that you are creating. What you have discussed earlier was that selection process for the Mode 1 app, but what we will be talking about now is how are we going to look at the portfolio. So where you've been in the Mendix digital transformation process is you have been looking at the first app, the selection of the first app, and now you're looking at the presentation place, no, not at the presentation, you're starting to look at the portfolio and how can you create out of that portfolio a roadmap of different applications. So Mendix would like to see the start, structure, scale phase as a mountain that you need to climb, but we'll make it simple for you. So you've reached the first peak. You've been able to create that first application. You've been able to celebrate. So you've probably seen the pictures of pies flying around here at Mendix, besides Avola, who has created this pie. So there are actually customers from LV over, so they have been able to celebrate and eat the pie. But one of the other artifacts that you will take out of that celebration and out of that first phase with Mendix are key thoughts and ideas on what other potential applications you can build with Mendix. So you will have a list. So you now have this great experience. You've gone to Basecamp together with your team, and you're now enjoying this view. But you need to look across the horizon, and when you look at the next plateau, you see a lot of question marks. So what are the next apps that I'm going to create? What is the roadmap? What is the sequentiality of the applications? And how am I going to piece this roadmap together in a logical format? And typical questions that you will start to encounter are, how am I going to fund these different projects that we're going to build? How does my Mode 2 organization comply with and align with the company strategy that we've set up? How do I create a balanced roadmap for the next 6 to 9 months? And remember that you also need to find the right fit with the bimodal capability or the Mode 2 application set that you've created. So these are all topics that have already been addressed earlier in your digital transformation route, but we will reiterate them here. So normally what you would think is sitting down with the team, looking with your Mendix partner, with Mendix, with your colleagues, you will have this list. And the first thing that will come to mind is how am I going to prioritize this list? And the first thing you should do is look at it from a strategic perspective. What is this portfolio about? What are the key themes that we are addressing within our organization? What you should also look at, value, is how is this portfolio set up? Are we building the right projects? Do we have the right chance of success with the projects that we're selecting? Are we selecting projects that take 2 years to complete? Or are we projects that are really customer specific, add value, and have a throughput time of maybe 3 to 5 months, for instance? And on the other hand, we also look at the balance of the specific portfolio. So do we have the right risks, or the right balance of the different applications that we're trying to create? So the project, does it have a short term with a low risk, or is it a higher risk project that potentially has a lot and adds a lot more value to the organization that we're working for? And last but not least, so the high risk versus the right mix versus short bets. So the first thing that you have to do is what's your company's vision, the big, hairy, audacious goal that you have set for the next 2 to 3 years, and how has this vision or mission been set up for your organization? Do you want to create double earnings? Do you want to be the most loved brand? Or do you want to become the most sustainable retailer, for instance, in your sector? So you need to understand the context of the projects of the organization that you're creating, and you need to be able to align the portfolio based on the strategic direction of your organization. Based on that, you'll have a number of choices. Generally, what you see is they say that you can either digitize processes, digitize channels, or do actual digital transformation, so transform the business model of the organization that you're in. What people often say is that's the biggest impact on the value, but also biggest chance of disruption, but also high risk, because sometimes that means that you need to cannibalize on your own existing organization. One key topic that you have inherited also from your earlier digital transformation steps is the Mendix Formula. Who here is using Mendix at the moment? Who here from those people who are using Mendix have a very specific Mendix Formula? Do you know what it is, for instance? The Mendix Formula? Who else has a Mendix, is using Mendix here? Yeah, do you have a Mendix Formula? So are there agreements on a technical or business fit with the type of application that you're looking for? That's something that we're also seeing, is you need to have a very concise and exact understanding of what are Mode 2 projects, what are Mode 1 projects. But also, from a business perspective, you want to look at those projects that have a specific time to market. You do or do not know what the requirements are. There are unclear business requirements in it first, because you really need to walk a specific journey to understand what the different possibilities are and the customer requirements are. But you also need to look at it from a technical perspective. So a data-driven, user-friendly working application, working in a multi-channel mode with supporting workflow or data integrations. So these are typical use cases that we see during the structure phase that will help organizations identify which potential projects are eligible to be used with Mendix. So basically, this is, on the one hand, we've looked now at the side of what is the intent of your organization for the next 2 years. So coming out of that come a number of labels, where to target those specific applications. You've looked at it from a business side, and now you look at it from a technical side as well. What we do within Mendix is also look at it from a complexity perspective. So not all the different applications that you would like to create are equal. Some are more difficult or more complex. For instance, if you look at the internal application from a business perspective, automating internal manual processes, they're different from external-facing customers, multi-channel customer self-service applications. If you look at it from a high complexity versus a high exposure, you're potentially looking at a customer self-service portal with transactional self-service capabilities, diving deep into your transactional data. Or you could look at it at a high complexity, low exposure, as a single view across different systems. Oh. What you can then do is you can start mapping these different applications. As you've seen, the grid has changed, but the idea is still the same. What you want to do is look at the different applications that you've identified how complex they are, how big they can potentially be, what the potential value of these specific applications is, and then map them on this complexity grid. And based on that, you can define specific applications and use these applications to define your roadmap with. So you've looked at the strategic core themes, you looked at potential velocities, because you've already created this one application with your team. You know how fast you can create this application. You can therefore transplant that to the different other potential projects. What you should also do, of course, is look at the market and the potential attractiveness of the proposal and the proposition that you've created. You need to use that into the balance of the specific application that you want to build, and use that to prioritize, but also to t-shirt size the different projects. Because what you also want to do is, with the team that you have, map those specific projects in time, sequentially, by value, to have the highest impact for that specific portfolio. So, what you need to think about is the strategic fit. You need to think about the value contribution of those set of projects that you're looking at. And you need to internalize the benefits of the application from a perspective of what is the perceived risk of this specific application and what capacity or resources are required. Based on these labels, because in essence these are labels that you can attach to the different applications or projects that you want to run, you can then start to have a structured approach to identify and start mapping your specific roadmap. And what you can then do based on the application type, and what you'll notice is there are no system of record here, so the assumption that I've made is that we are already looking at mode 1 or mode 2 applications already. So this is applications that are suitable to be used in a Mendix environment or be created by Mendix. And for instance, we're looking at systems of innovation such as a procurement or HR workflow and performance appraisal or customer self-service applications. And we've mapped these out, conform the estimated size. And this is something that we can then use to create and build a roadmap with. So far, so good? Good. So what you now have seen is how we, within Mendix, and this is something that we do, I think you've seen Roald's presentation or Peter's presentation earlier today, based on a structured approach within Mendix. We will gather this information and this output with you in a portfolio workshop to help you and guide you through the structure phase within Mendix. So during the start phase, we'll create together with you an overview of a number of potential applications. This is for those customers who are working with Mendix, working with our partners, and go through this digital transformation process. And we will work together with you to create this portfolio and make sure that it is balanced and that you know what projects you could work on with your team. But what you also need to do in the same phase is not looking at the actual applications or potential projects that you have, but you also need to start preparing. You need to start preparing for the time when there are no existing lists with potential apps, but you need to start preparing for how are we going to make sure that we can fill a list with apps. So how are we going to make sure that we, in the scale phase, once the 5 apps have been, for instance, or the 10 apps have been created, how are you going to make sure that you are able to find new ideas, that you're able to fund the selection of the ideas, that you're able to fund the creation and the implementation and prototyping of those specific ideas. So this is something that we need to look at. So one of the key things that we see is where it goes wrong, and I've seen it with many customers, is that they are not or too late thinking about, so how should we then fund this mode 2 ideation/innovation funnel that we're creating with the Mendix platform. Because you've probably seen this slide over and over today, funding is one of the most critical inhibitors to success for the CIO. But it's not only for the CIO, it is also an inhibitor for success for Mendix, the Mendix platform being able to be used in a scale session. And it's not that these tactics are not known. And the same report from Gartner shows that only 40% of the CIOs are actually using funding, alternative methods of funding, and that basically means that 60% of the CIOs are not doing it. And there are many different options available. And what you see is that one of the key things that you need to think about is how can we set up an ideation funnel that makes sense, or an innovation funnel, where we have a research stage, a prototype stage, and a pilot stage. And in every single phase, you would have different buckets of money associated to those phases that will allow you to deal with different prototyping or ideation or actual development of apps. For instance, in the pilot phase, you would focus on identifying the target audience. In the prototyping phase, you would be looking at the understanding and identifying the feasibility of a specific idea. And what you see is that the majority of respondents from an innovation leader questionnaire earlier last year showed that only in the first stage, the majority is only applying 500K to facilitate innovations in those sessions. And you'll see that the budget shifts dramatically the further down the development stage or the in-market stage that you will get. Now, what we see is that there's a number of different options, and these are just 4 or 5 of the different versions that we see. So, for instance, funding the factory line, iterative funding, incremental and internal crowdfunding instead of external crowdfunding, or facilitating innovation by providing an actual fixed innovation budget. Who of you have an actual structured innovation process in place in your organization? If you look around, I saw 3 or 4 hands in the air, which I find is interesting. So if you look back at this slide, there's beside different funding, there's another challenge, is implement a structured innovation process. What we see is, has anybody of you been to the presentation by RWS earlier today? Rijkswaterstaat in Dutch, for those who are Dutch. They have a different approach to this. They've got a methodology in place called the Idea Factory. So what they've done is they've said they've got a pre-allocated budget, and with that pre-allocated budget, they can look at a number of projects every year, and with this they have a fixed approach. So if you've got an idea, that idea needs to be looked at, supported by your manager. If your manager supports it, you get an idea one day with an analyst to look at the idea, write a case, and work it out. If that goes through the approval, you can then go to the next phase. In that phase, you will have another 4 days where you will have a business developer or a Mendix developer working together with you to create an actual small prototype. And based on that prototype, you need to convince the business for buy-in and get the next round of funding. I think LV is doing something similar, be it a bit more different, but we were just talking about that, Rob. Another point, what you see, and I was talking to someone yesterday where this was actually the case, this is when you start your big idea and you bet on your first big project instead of looking at a smaller project with a minimum lovable product, but you use an approach where you go for the big bang at once, where you're not having these intermediary interactions with your customers on fit for purpose, and on value. And I'll come back to that later, because basically what you'll see is there's a lot of projects that are getting killed because they're not in line with what the business wants, and at the end they've proven not to be technically feasible. So iterative development is about betting small, not big, upfront, and start with smaller iterations and proving value as you go along. But this is also about, after you've created your first project, make sure that you budget for additional releases, because that's also not always the case. This is a Mendix customer, calling Crowdfund. And as the name says, what they do is they fund ideas from the crowd. And this is an alternative to getting a savings deposit, or they provide, you can fund ideas. And based on these ideas, you get a specific output. So this is one of the things that you will also have to think about, and there are examples of a Dutch insurer, one of them is sitting at the back, where we need to think about how can you support, if you're creating multiple apps in the structure phase, and 3 out of those apps are internal applications, who is then going to fund single sign-on? Who's going to fund generic services for those specific applications? You need to think about how am I going to fund it. Am I going to do internal crowdfunding? Because that's something that you see, is different projects see that this is something that I would want embedded in my next project, so I'll take 1/4 of the cost for this specific development. Another option that you have is experimentation. And what I see is it is something that a lot of companies are very afraid of. Digital experimentation allows customers to fail fast and learn a lot. So one of the things that we need to think about is how you can scope experiments, make the risks as small as possible. And one of the things that you can do there is make sure that you got the right success criteria beforehand, that you run experiments in the fields with existing and real customers, but also that you capture key insights and that you monetize on the value of the lessons learned. So one of the key things that we think is that this fear, because your CFO will probably not like it when you say that you want to start experimenting and that potentially 70% of the applications that you think you would create are going to fail. Most organizations will get into a tight fit, to put it like that. And there are ways to go around that. For instance, using principles like design thinking and lean startup, that helps you to move the paralysis of fear by building on empathy for customer contact or focusing on improving individual customer touchpoints. I think in the earlier presentation today, there was an example of the scanning device, the MRT scanner in a hospital. How is this being used, and how could you use it in another way that is not scary for little children? But also, you need to think about how can you create a portfolio of experiments that you can test on. The majority of the ideas that we see, this is also from that Innovation Leader report. And what was very interesting here is that they had 199 respondents in, I think this was worldwide. What they looked at is large and small organizations, and they looked at why specific projects failed. And what they found out was that projects failed, first of all, because there was no business value or no business buy-in, which after 7 months or a year is very odd. And second of all, because the application or the project appeared to be technically unfeasible. Now, if you're using an agile approach and you're agile experimenting and you're involving your business and you're iteratively validating value and you're iteratively validating technical feasibility, this should not happen, not after a year. And if you look at, I think 1/3 of the projects that were associated with this research had larger than 250K sunk cost associated to them. So being very concise about to be very concise about when to kill a project is also something that you need to think about. Another best practice that we've seen is using and introducing customer innovation management, a formal innovation management approach. I think in the earlier question that I asked, there are not a lot of people here who are actually implementing or using a formal innovation management process. And this is besides funding or crowdsourcing, which funny enough is the most effective way most effective bimodal tactic. It's also the one that's least used. The second least used is in this case, formal innovation management. And formal innovation management, when it comes to using those bimodal disciplines, it suggests that many enterprises are focused on what's easy rather than what's effective. What you need to look at again is not making an entire huge introduction of an innovation approach, but start in a simple way. Start with an ideation process. And you can keep ideation simple. This is about the gathering of different ideas. It requires running a broad-based innovation training program that requires significant time and resources. So simple lean up, startup, or design thinking methodologies are potentially a lot easier to implement. And you can think about it from the human perspective. Frame it from the customer. Use a target persona, so these are best practices that you can see are derived from marketing, or how do we approach our marketing programs, for instance. But also actually hypothesize on the problem that the customer was trying to solve. And the way that we can look at that is very simple. We can look at it from what is the question or the intent the customer is trying to solve. mapping out who is involved, so the user persona, understanding what the experience is that he's experiencing right now, and then identifying key themes for improvement. Then you have a clear opportunity or belief that it can be improved, and then you can actually, in the normal iterative cycle of creating an agile project, create an application, test it with the users, gather feedback, and come up with a new version, or sync it. And then you will have, and if you haven't sunk it, you will have a functional proven project, similar to the approach that RWS is using, and you'll have a business case alongside with it to work on the next steps. Now, Mendix World, as you can probably see, is a very hectic setup with a lot of information, a lot of insight. So my presentation will not be very long. It's actually the last slide. But what I will show you is that there are many different ideas on what type of applications or what type of projects you could create with Mendix. So I would like you to have a look at this. I'm sure that the presentation will be shared later on after or will be made available. But these are the types of applications that are currently being built using the Mendix platform. So I suggest look around, ask around, because the people downstairs, they have created these applications. Tomorrow during the hackathon, you'll see 13 teams with, I think, 40 or 45 people. They're one down, I think, yeah. Who have been creating a dozen of apps for Enexis and for ISS, all based on a hackathon, all based on ideas that came from these 40 people. And they came up with very new ideas that were not already on the how do you say that, the focus of the business leads at Enexis. So tap into your organization, start an ideation environment, start an old-fashioned idee box that also still works, but tap into the experience and into the problems that your customers are and your own employees are faced with, and start learning. The next thing that I wanted to show is that this is not so much a cliffhanger, but this is positive. You're nearly at the top, but you cannot get at the top on your own. To get there, you'll need a team, and the next digital transformation program presentation that will be tomorrow will be on how can you select, train, and implement a team. What should the setup of the team be? What are the different team roles, and how will this team get you through the structure to the scale phase? Okay, that's it.